There's this idea that I love that all the knowledge that humanity holds is like a giant bubble, and research is kind of how we push the edges of that bubble. And being part of that process of expanding what humans know is something that I find incredibly meaningful. But, like while I was a full-time student, I couldn't work more than 20 hours a week. And even though I was fortunate to be paid for my research, it wasn't quite enough to support myself. So I got a job at Cleveland Clinic's main campus as a patient sitter. And then I eventually promoted to be a nursing assistant.
What if the most dangerous assumptions in medicine aren't the mistakes we know about, but the ones we don't even question? In this episode of The DNA of Things, we meet Kristin Lee, a young scientist with the mind of a code breaker. Trained in neuroscience, psychology, and bioethics, she refuses to accept that science should just be about what is, or medicine, how to intervene. Instead, she demands we ask why. From her research in stem cells to her work with patients, Kristin's journey exposes the hidden architectures of power, consent, and access that shape modern health. Together, we'll uncover how her questions challenge us to look deeper at the ethics of potential, the responsibilities of innovation, and the human stories often lost in our race for discovery. This isn't just about science. It's about rethinking the questions we're brave enough to ask. A rising innovator at the intersection of biology and data, Kristin Lee is a recent graduate of Case Western Reserve University's prestigious combined bachelor's and master's program. With a specialized focus on systems biology and bioethics, her work explores the complex networks governing human health and the profound ethical questions raised by emerging technologies like CRISPR-Cas9 and gene editing, artificial intelligence. So driven by her passion to democratize health insights, Kristin represents the next generation of scientific leaders who think in ecosystems, not in silos. Her fresh perspective and technical acumen make her a vital voice in the conversation about how we design our future. Kristin Lee, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
All right. I should say that your reputation precedes you, at least to me anyway, through Dr. Koenig, who we had on the show, probably 6-8 months ago now, on her book, CRISPR. And I believe she was your university prof.
Yes, I had 2 classes with her, and I was so lucky to have her as my major advisor as well. So we talked quite a bit.
Amazing. And what were the 2 classes?
I took Biology 216. That was a physiology class. And then I took biology, I want to say it's 302. And that was human learning in the brain. And that class is very interesting because it talked about kind of how people learn in different scenarios. And yeah, it was very interesting.
Amazing. I had a mentor like that in undergrad. Her name was Dr. Melanie Dobson. She was the first female Canadian Rhodes Scholar, first human to see the Y chromosome be sequenced. She worked in Ed Southern's lab, who I believe was a Nobel winner for his work in, the Southern blot. I don't know if it's used so much anymore, but there's a DNA hybridization identification tool long before the sequencing technologies that we have now. But Melanie, I had her in, I guess it was nucleic acids. And then I also had her in medical biotech, and a lot of things we talked about back then, 20 years ago, if you can believe it, are coming to fruition now. So CRISPR-Cas9, mRNA vaccines, those were things that were just kind of ideas back then. And so, here you are kind of at the very beginning of your career, and I can only imagine where we might be 20 years from now. And so as I'm sure we'll, start to explore some of that, I'd love to speak a little bit to like how you chose your area of study. So, one of the things I recall from our first conversation is you started in psychology, but then you moved more into neuroscience, and then we got into this bioethics component. So what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long answer for this one. I initially started in psychology because I was really interested in mental health. I spent the last year and a half of my high school completely online during the pandemic. But once I got into the introductory psychology courses, at Case Western, I found myself a little unfulfilled because a lot of the curriculum focused on diagnostic disorders through patterns in the DSM-5, which is like the diagnostic manual for psychological disorders. And I kind of felt like we were just putting people into boxes without really understanding the mechanisms of what they were experiencing. And that's when one of my professors suggested that I try introductory neuroscience classes because that would cover that a bit better for me. And I remember learning something like depression, for example, is linked to changes in serotonin reuptake. And suddenly it wasn't just depression is X, Y, and Z, but like this is how it might actually be, how things in your brain might actually be causing depression. And that deeper mechanistic perspective was what I was craving. As I continued to pursue neuroscience, I joined a genetics lab that was focused on glial cells. And it has now become a whole institute of glial sciences. But we worked with mice, human organoids, induced pluripotent stem cells. And just the deeper that I got into that world, the more I started asking different kinds of questions, like how do findings in basic science actually translate into clinical practice or public health policy? And who decides when something we discover in vitro will actually become something that affects real people's lives? And that's kind of when bioethics started to pull me in. I wasn't really looking to see if my science was ethical, but more just in the broader sense, systems of power and access and accountability and how these things are shaping how science is used. I think that kind of pulled me into bioethics.
Mm-hmm. And so you did a combined degree. So this was, so help me understand, it's like an undergraduate and a master's degree at the same time. Is that correct? I think you got
Yes.
that right.
So in the past, they only allowed this program for people pursuing bachelor's of arts. And because they changed the laws in Ohio about how many credits can be double counted, I had to really fight to get the BA in psychology, the BS in neuroscience, and on top of that, get a master's in bioethics, while also having them allow me to graduate in 4 years. It was a lot.
Well, I mean, it sounds to me like you might be the only person that's done that degree at that university. Is that fair to say? Is there anybody else that would have done those three things in those three subject areas specifically?
I think this combination of degrees, probably there might be some other people that are going to do it in the future or are doing it now because the master's is only a 1-year program. But right. I know that there are a lot of people that are interested in both neuroscience and bioethics, given that the combination of both, you get neuroethics, and that's a whole field in itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just jump back to something you said at the beginning that you didn't like. Well, actually, even before that, because this is a rare moment where we're actually speaking to somebody who was navigating the pandemic from, a position of, early development, youth, coming of age, in your high school year, you said that's when you were, right? That's when you're experiencing it. So everything was this kind of went from somewhat of a social life in the analog world and everything just became digital. Did you get to have a graduation?
Yes, I was able to, but I remember they did the graduation online for my sister's middle school. And then my high school graduation is usually like indoor, but they had to put it on the football field. There were just a lot of things that changed because of the pandemic.
Right. And so was that the trigger for you to better understand mental health because of the things you were seeing fall out around you, or did you already have that interest going into the pandemic?
Well, going into the pandemic, I knew I was good at science, and having the experience of the pandemic helped me realize that there was a demand for people in psychology just because of what was happening to everybody, people being like alone, isolated, people were seeing therapists more and people were starting to believe in psychology a little bit more. And that's kind of what drew me in.
Got it. And so then you come in to study the discipline yourself. And the way I would summarize what you said about putting people into boxes is something that my physiotherapist said to me recently when, a hip issue. She's like, oh, well, I think it's just piriformis syndrome. I'm like, piriformis syndrome, that seems kind of like a blanket statement. And she said, well, labels are for soup cans after all, right? But they help us, or at least classify things broadly. And so I guess I understood the, kind of utility of it. But if it's just kind of like, hey, you have piriformis syndrome and that's it, then I'm kind of stuck, and it kind of doesn't lend itself to a silver bullet of a treatment. And in fact, the root cause of your piriformis syndrome could be a spondylolisthesis in your L4. It could be labral tear in your hip. It could be any number of other kind of pelvic imbalances. And so the label sometimes, at least in my experience, leaves you to a superficial understanding of it, you as the person receiving the care, and not really sophisticated enough to ask the right questions. And so, by my own, kind of academic background, similar to yours, like mechanistically getting to the root cause of things, I'm able to collaborate with my practitioner, to figure out, the manifestation of the pain. And so you did that with neuroscience, and but at the same time, again, this is me just kind of extrapolating. So tell me if I'm off here. You kind of saw more of a cultural phenomenon as well as, hey, there are these policies that we act out, like isolation and, digital transformation of education and a lot of the things that we used to do socially. And there are some negative effects from that. Well, who gets to decide that in the first place? How do we decide that? And then that kind of, again, I'm just kind of trying to stitch together what you said is, okay, well, now there's, in parallel to that, it's like, hey, here's how we're going to use this new technology, mRNA vaccines, for example.
Yeah.
At a population level. How do we decide that? And are we going to do a debrief on that? Like, was it the right decision in the end? And what's the next technology that we're going to use? Because, I'm starting to see, murmurs of, CRISPR-Cas9 and, companies that allow you to screen the embryos that you're looking to implant for, people who are going through in vitro fertilization. And so CRISPR-Cas9 being applied in some scenarios that we spoke about previously. And so I'd really love to, understand this kind of ethics of potential, right? That I think you've come into, and in particular, you reference this idea like, hey, you are this, undifferentiated cell, right? You could be anything right now. And so, but there are all these things that are calling you to differentiate or to potentially specialize. And I'm wondering how that journey has been unfolding, for you. And, have you been pulled into, a particular problem set, that's really kind of capturing your interest. So it's kind of I guess a two-part question here is, broadly speaking, this problem we've circled around is the ethics of potential. Who defines what is good and what we should pursue as a human species, and then where you see yourself in that landscape.
Yeah. So going back to the intermediate cell thing that we were talking about.
Yes.
I just want to give a little more background for people that don't really know. So in my research, we work with induced pluripotent stem cells, which they're just cells that are taken from wherever, and they could be reverted back to a stem cell state. And you do this by giving it certain growth factors and putting it in certain medias. And what you could do with these induced pluripotent stem cells is that you could differentiate them into a specific cell type. So all the cells in your culture are the same type of cell. In my lab, we work with oligodendrocyte progenitor cells, or at least I work with them. But I kind of see myself as an oligodendrocyte progenitor cell because they're further along in development. They're not the totally undifferentiated stem cell, but they're still full of potential. So these progenitor cells can develop into oligodendrocytes or astrocytes, or they could even stay in the progenitor state for a little bit longer. So that's why I said that I see myself as a progenitor cell. It's because I've had enough growth factors, so to speak, like through experiences and mentors and research to know that I want to be in biomedical science, but I'm still trying to figure out what I want to differentiate into, finally, what I want to mature into. So I like this analogy because it's really exciting. I see myself as like an intermediate cell, and it just feels like things are full of possibility. But I guess the things that kind of helped me to determine what I wanted to do, I guess the growth factors were that I'd been doing research since my freshman year in college. Like I said, working in the Glial Institute with MD, PhD students, and staff scientists. I really love doing research. And for the longest time, I was sure that I wanted to pursue a PhD because I admire the way that PhDs think about science and the world and how they're always questioning everything. And there's this idea that I love that all the knowledge that humanity holds is like a giant bubble, and research is kind of how we push the edges of that bubble. And being part of that process of expanding what humans know is something that I find incredibly meaningful. But, like while I was a full-time student, I couldn't work more than 20 hours a week. And even though I was fortunate to be paid for my research, it wasn't quite enough to support myself. So I got a job at Cleveland Clinic's main campus as a patient sitter, and then I eventually promoted to be a nursing assistant. And the thing is, like, I loved that too. I loved getting to know the patients over time, seeing them improve throughout their stay, and just seeing how their experience in the hospital would shape their future hospital experiences, because I've been working there for quite a while now. And just seeing how, like, what they do with their health information and how they better their lives based on this hospital experience. And that sense of being useful in this medical environment, just like it hit a different part of me than how research did. It made me realize that I also saw myself in medicine, because medicine is where the science meets the people. So as I think about my next steps and thinking about my ethics background and just thinking about how all these experiences have shaped me, I'm just really looking for signals, like growth factors in the world that'll tell me where I'll be able to serve best. I'm drawn to paths where I can bridge both worlds, the medicine and the research, doing the deep, curious research, but also kind of staying connected to the human side of science. That's where I see myself being. And after realizing that I've had this, like, I guess, bioethics drive, like choosing to pursue psychology because of the pandemic, I've also considered being a clinical ethicist, because in that role you get to guide complex medical decisions, but you also contribute on a broader level, such as serving on institutional review boards for research. And that kind of work really speaks to me because it involves both the human side of care and the systemic questions on how we treat people fairly and responsibly in science and in medicine. But yeah, that's a whole ton of words. But ultimately, I think I'll find myself most useful and most fulfilled in a more physician scientist role, because I want to be someone who can both care for patients and push the boundaries of what we know through research, particularly as we navigate new frontiers in genetic technology. My foundation, bioethics, gives me the lens to ask not only can we do something, but should we do something? And how can we do it in a way that benefits everyone? I hope that answers most of your questions.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how I know it did is because it's made me think of another question. So yeah, that's an amazing perspective. And, call it serendipity, providence, fate, whatever. Just last week, I was talking to you. I had Dr. Mark Charnopolsky on the podcast, and he is a version of what you're talking about, right? So he's an MD and he's a PhD, and he works in seemingly contradictory fields. So he actually works within, rare disease and human performance, aging populations, and in pediatrics, right? And he's entrepreneurial, and he has his own, nutrition company as well, because he's seen that, there's a lot of suboptimal information out there, putting it kindly, and products. So, so it's interesting. We talked a lot about what, and how you might pursue. Have you given any thought to like, and if no is okay, and if no's the answer, it's okay. But like the role models that because I found that when I replace the word like how, it can be a real daunting thing sometimes, and I just change 2 letters around, like go to who, and there's a lot of examples out there, and obviously you're not going to have like an exact replica of you, and thank goodness for that, because Kristin Lee is going to follow Kristin Lee's path, obviously. But like for example, when I did my graduate school, I was at a similar point to you. I was like, should I do medicine or should I do the PhD? And I struggled with that for a long time. And it was really when I met Ford Doolittle, who was my PhD supervisor, who I just said, I think that if I work with Ford, I'll learn how to think properly about things. And so I guess I kind of, I exactly, took on that position. And, I really like your stem cell analogy so much because, one of the things that, Ford became known for, in as much as he did his undergrad at Harvard and his PhD at Stanford, and I can't remember the scientist's name. It was the Russian scientist who got a White House medal for putting forward the paradigm of 1 gene, 1 protein, 1 function, which of course now today we know is not true. And you see Ford he's a contrarian. And that's really what he spent his PhD doing, is like arguing with his professor, his principal investigator. And that's what he encouraged, me to do as well. Is like, don't just agree with me and don't worry about, production in terms of how many lines or how many papers or whatever. It's like, how are you thinking about this? And one of the things that he brought to light was this, ENCODE project, ENCODE, which I can't remember the amount of funding, but it wasn't insignificant. But it was essentially born out of this idea that, well, the majority of our genome is junk, and that can't be true. And so I think we need to better understand it and make some experiments to prove that these junk DNA regions are not junk and they have a function. And so Ford had a huge problem with this, because now you're paying people to do science geared at a specific outcome, which in the end was actually unclear. It was like, well, what do you even mean by function? He wrote a paper in Proceedings of National Academy of Science, like begging that question. And so his career moved from more molecular biologist to philosopher. And those are the kind of hard questions that he asks. And, it may seem, I don't know, a little certainly provocative. Maybe you're a bit of an instigator if you're asking hard questions, but it takes a lot of work to get to that question. So, and is this the question we should answer? Is this the right question? Should we answer it? So anyway, I put that out there because it's just another option where you're looking to specialize. It's like, oh, well, wait a minute. Being a generalist might not be so bad either. So take, for example, like now what we have with AI, we were talking about my daughter before we started. I'm thinking about her program, her education pursuit, and there are all these tools to accelerate our learning of the STEM. So like science, technology, engineering, maths, et cetera. And, on the one hand, there's it looks like possibility that we can outsource all of that to AI, right? Like I don't have to be a great engineer anymore. I don't have to be a great planner. And it's like, well, but some of the first principle of those skills, I think, are very important. I guess what I'm saying is, though, you can acquire the first principles and you don't have to go so far down the rabbit hole, so far differentiated, and lose the forest through the trees. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And so, I think that's kind of where you got to naturally. So I'm going to challenge you that you might be able to do all 3 of those things, right? So to read the PhD, the MD, and what did you call it? The clinical ethicist?
Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
It's a clinical ethicist and professionals that they help physicians and providers and patients make decisions for themselves or for their patients, like if they should continue on life support or pursue palliative care and things like that. Yeah, there's so many options.
Right. So I've centered on, and this is only recently, and I'm probably twice your age. And I've literally kind of come to this maybe in the past few weeks, is that one of the things that I think I can do is help more people, and when I say people, probably more families, start a conversation with their DNA, right? So, and really what I'm saying when I mention that is that, hey, there's this life code that is not going to tell you who you are, right? I don't believe in genetic determinism. There's a rare number of instances where that's true, but the better we understand our genome, the more those things become untrue. Like there will be a cure for Huntington's disease, for example. Rare disease, I mean, everybody is at least a carrier, so it's actually less rare than we think insofar as an entire umbrella statement. And so I'm really passionate about getting people to understand how to speak that language. And I think now with all these different tools, we can do that more easily. Question is, okay, well, where's the data stored? So that's like an ethical thing that we're seeing with 23andMe and the hacks and the recent auctions and then the reacquisition. And I'm not pointing fingers at 23andMe. I'm just pointing more generally at and I think we spoke to like the HeLa cells as an example, right? It's like, hey, here's a cell line that nobody gave any permission to use that donor's biology, but here we are. And in the same way, I think people are signing off and submitting their DNA as part of studies. I don't think they really know what they're signing off on. And okay, you might say, well, it's not a big deal. It's de-identified, et cetera. But it's like, okay, but what if like the family was empowered with that information and had that information in context in real time when they go and they speak to their pediatrician or, GP or specialist or anesthesiologist when they're getting surgery. Like there's life-saving information. So I'm thinking, okay, if I can get more people access to that information, I can save lives. And if I can do it in a responsible way where it's in the family, it's, I think, compelling. And there's context that's brought to the DNA. It's not just like, here's your DNA and diagnosis, and this is going to affect your health insurance or life insurance policy. No, it's much more action oriented. So that's me. That's a problem that I'm really wrestling with right now. From your perspective, is there something that you're being pulled to? Like we started with the mental health side of it. We're into the technology. Well, what technology and who says so? Is there a specific area that you're, most drawn to? And it can be general at this point too, because I know you're so early in your career.
Yeah. So with everything you've just said, some things that came to my mind were medical literacy. Like, first of all, you can make information super accessible. You can have ChatGPT explain anything to you. I dug into one day how you could use ChatGPT to determine whether you should be going to like the emergency room, urgent care, or if you should just wait and see like your family medicine provider. And it was so useful because you could just type in like, I have these symptoms and this is what's happening to me. Like, what should I do? And like ChatGPT would say, this is something that is pretty urgent, so you don't have to see a family medicine, but it's not so crazy that it warrants going to an ER. And I think just making the information not only available, but also accessible is very important to like promoting well-being and I guess like understanding your DNA. Another thing that I was talking about when you're talking about the HeLa cells was, and also 23andMe, is the importance of informed consent. We talk a lot about this in our bioethics classes. Like for the example of 23andMe, you get this package and they get your DNA and you get to find out all this, and you just have to scroll down and click a checkbox and you're in the system and you get your information. But what people aren't realizing is that they're basically giving permission to this company to do whatever they want with their genetic data. And like even things that the company won't expect, like going bankrupt, they don't talk about what's going to happen to your data like after the company, like if the company were to end, if they get to send the data off to be used in research and whatnot. And something that we've talked about very extensively in bioethics is the importance of, I guess, continued informed consent and continued like checking with the people that you're getting data from or samples from throughout time if it is still permissible to be using these samples.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just so much to talk about in this sphere.
It's yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Like, for example, even with like your cell phone contract, it's like nobody reads that. There's no way you would get out of if you go to Apple or wherever you go to, you wouldn't get out of the store on the same day because it's a very thorough document because it's written by really good lawyers. But hey, here's the cool thing is, you mentioned your co-pilot here, like ChatGPT. It's like now you can take this legal document and say, should I sign this? Like, what are the top 3 reasons why I might not sign this? Right. And, like what's really being said here and what are the risks? And so again, it does come back to that, like empowering people to ask the right questions, right? Because now you've got a little decoder, right? In the form of, Chat GPT, which, that's a separate conversation because what LLM is it trained on, right? Grok is different than Chat is different than Claude is different from, you could build your own, right? So, and then, okay, well, where's the bias? And then, are you aware of those biases when you use it? I mean, it's like the analogy is the cookies on your browser influence your Google search. So, okay. And say in the best case scenario, it's giving you geographical pertinent information. And so that's better for you. But, well, there's also people that pay Google to point you to them. Right. And if it's something I need, like to buy my daughter a birthday present, well, that's okay. But if it's something that I don't need and I'm getting, gradually nudged towards something that's actually unhealthy for me, like buying alcohol, for example, who's correcting for that? And, I guess in one of the ways that, okay, so here's a question for you is like, how might we learn from our missteps with social media? Because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's like people lose their dogs and the community groups, hey, I found my dog, right? And so it's like those can be, really, I mean, beyond pets, it can be life-saving, missing children. So the tools are essentially very useful, but, obviously there's been missteps. I think, self-esteem and, young women, teenagers in particular, like that's a, massive problem. And so what do you see there in terms of us learning from social media? Are there any lessons we can pull there that would apply to technology, but to bioethics?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing that I think about when you asked me this was when I am getting information, I make sure that I get things from multiple sources, especially politics. That's a big thing. I will look at various news sources. I'll get like New York Times, Fox News, see what everybody's saying. Otherwise, you kind of just get pulled into this system where like you feel a certain way and just the things that you're seeing are making it worse. And that's how like the polarization occurs. I think that's very much something that social media does. I know that if you are constantly looking at a certain type of media, then they'll keep feeding it to you. And while I've been thinking about AI as well, and it's a little bit different because you kind of have to ask for things before they start giving it to you. And while they do, if you allow it, they can keep your information and like get to know you and give you information that's tailored to what they know about you. But yeah, I don't know where I'm really going with this, but
well, I think you do. I think where you've got me thinking is, well, actually, the content that we consume will affect our health, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways, actually, use an example just from my daughter today. She was having leftover hamburger patty from yesterday, and my wife put out some ketchup for her, and it's like, oh yeah, well, it's organic and no preservatives and all that, but it's mostly sugar. And Brooke's like, more? I'm like, sign language more. It's like, yeah, right here, more. It's because it's like we're all kind of like children in some way, shape, or form, right? And like asking for more of something that's not good for us. And so, especially if you find yourself in social media, it's you don't even think about the decisions that you're making, but all of a sudden there's like 10,000 decisions that you made that have trained the algorithm to, I don't know, point you to cat videos, I guess is my point. So okay. So I think really what we're saying is the interface between the digital world and the real world, right, is, as we've already seen, how we interface with technology can be a predictor of health, the negative outcomes that you saw during COVID, for example. So I guess that's the question that I'm driving at is, how do we look, is there a place in your future where you kind of, straddle that domain as part of your inquiry as a scientist?
Yeah. So something else that we can discuss is how people have been using AI more and more in research. I know one of my friends in biomedical engineering, he was talking about how if you use ChatGPT, you're supposed to like add it as a co-author. And I do think that like what we're seeing in the media might not always be true. And that's the same thing with AI. It's the AI gets its information from certain sources. Whoever's making the AI is giving like humanely biased information. So just the use of AI kind of takes away the humanity from the work that you're doing if you are using AI in a sense.
Yeah, where I found AI like very effective is in like helping me organize and categorize my thoughts. I don't tend to ask it to create for me. I like it more as an editor and an organizer, because I'll have a tendency to like, my mind will go in a million different directions at the same time. And so I'll get there either through writing. Like I generally write with all my ideas, like kind of analog. And then what I'll do is I'll dictate down. And then, what would happen in the past of, let's say, during my PhD is there's that just painful period of time where you have to go through that self-organization of all the studies that you've done, all the papers that you've written, and then you've got to like harmonize it all together. It's like, can you believe it, the manual imputation of references, right? So I know that's like, now you have like EndNote or some other version now that formats that all for you automatically. But, painstakingly going through those steps were, kind of a rite of passage / coming of age. What did it slow down the research? It's like, you might say in some ways yes, but in other ways no, because it would cause me to look twice or three times at things that I would have cited and come to understand them differently, looking at them again the second or third time around, like 2 or 3 years later, because I'm different now versus, it's pretty easy. Like that, like I've come across a lot of engineers, software engineers, and there's this term that they use called vibe coding. So it's like, they're not even writing the code anymore. They're just asking ChatGPT to write the code, and then they're editing the code. Like, no, make it like this, do it like this. And so that's really neat because you don't actually have to go to the language, like the software language, and then the code interpreters and the debugging and all that. So I guess that's good if you're like a masterful coder. And then it's like, you're kind of like, so comparing it to a masterful writer using Microsoft Word for the first time. It's like, okay, I've already developed all my skills and I understand the first principles of writing. And so now this is going to just help me with the efficiencies of the task. But if you, I guess, jump to the efficiency before the effectiveness, like really kind of shape the idea of the question that you're aiming to solve, then you get given that question and and it's not even your question, which I think is what you were saying, like looking at different sources. Where is this coming from? Do I really think this? Is this really the question that I wanted to answer? And so, okay. So in terms of, your, deep dive as a bioethicist, right? And all of the work that you've done into the lab, how how are you different than 4 years ago? And, there is this, I'm not sure we came up in our conversation. Well, I think it was. I think there's like, emotional bias and the importance of scientific objectivity and resisting the urge to use labels prematurely. So you're on the other side of that now, right? And so I guess there's kind of maybe a two-part question here, which is, what's your advice for freshmen this year or high school students about to embark upon what you've finished, right? And then, the bigger question is, what do you want to leave behind? 20, like who's this all for in 20, 30, 100 years, assuming you live that long? Like what would you leave behind?
Okay, so I think my 1 year bioethics education, I think it gave me a third dimension for thinking. Because before I was just about the science and the medicine, but like bioethics made me step back and think about, I guess, like life in general. Science, I feel like, tells us what something is, and then medicine will focus on how we intervene, and then bioethics will ask the harder, more fundamental questions like, why are we doing this, and like, should we even be doing this? As a scientist and a researcher, I've realized how much power there is in the questions that we ask and the data that we collect, and especially in how we choose to present our findings. These decisions can influence so many things like clinical research and policy, and eventually like real people's lives. So the weight kind of shifted with my bioethics education on how I think about why I'm doing my research and how I'm doing my research. And I think like now, whenever I'm making a decision for research, daily life, whatever, I find myself not just thinking about like, is it effective? Is it evidence-based? I also think about like, who would this apply to? How will this shape, I guess, treatment? And like, am I considering perspectives beyond my own perspectives? Yeah, bioethics just forces you to zoom out and think across various communities and systems and across time. And that is something that I want to carry with me every day. As for the advice that I would give to a young scientist or freshman high schoolers, I would tell people to just try everything that they might be even a little bit interested in. I mean, bioethics, it was just a little thing in the back of my head. I took one class and it was like, okay, like this is pretty interesting. But yeah, every time I do something, I try to do it all the way. And that is what has led me to being able to get all this like wide, broad education. So yeah, I would tell people to take every opportunity that is given to them.
Amazing. Well, without trying, we've actually got to the final question that I had for you, which was, what one person would you nominate as my next guest on the DNA of Things, and why?
So I would nominate Dr. Insoo Hyun. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but he is the director of the Center of Life Sciences and Public Learning at the Museum of Science in Boston. He teaches at Harvard Medical School, and he was formerly a professor of bioethics and philosophy at Case Western. So I met him through a guest lecture. What makes him perfect for this podcast is that he's not just thinking about the science, he's really thinking about how it affects people, kind of what I want to have at like the basis of my research. His work is on stem cell ethics, and I believe he does some gene editing policy, but he's really good at breaking things down in a way that makes people stop and think. And he doesn't shy away from the hard questions. He's incredibly thoughtful and human about all the work that he does. So yeah, I would recommend him.
Amazing. Well, I will do my best to try and track him down. I'll certainly extend the invitation and again communicate to him, as was communicated to me, that his reputation precedes him as yours did. And I'm delighted at our conversation, Kristin. My outlook on the future is better having gotten to speak to someone like you, and I'm sure our listeners will feel the same. So please let me thank you for spending the time with me today.
Yeah, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
We've traveled today with Kristin Lee, through the unseen corridors of biomedicine where breakthroughs often outpace our understanding of their consequences. Her story isn't simply one of academic success, it's a challenge to each of us to scrutinize the systems and assumptions we inherit. Kristin has shown us how even the most advanced technologies carry the bias of their markers, and how true progress demands informed consent, ethical reflection, and deep humility. As listeners, we're left with a question that lingers long after the episode ends. Now that we've seen what lies beneath the surface, what will we do with this knowledge? Will we dare to ask the harder questions? Will we help build a science that not only cures, but also cares? The responsibility is ours now to think deeply, act wisely, and ensure that the future of health is defined not by speed alone, but by ethics, empathy, and understanding.